Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we're going to talk a little history today. And with us to help us do that is Michael J. Douma. He's an assistant research professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business, and he is also the editor of The Liberal Approach to the Past. Professor Douma, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you, Michael. I'm a associate professor now. It's a big deal in these
Oh, okay.
in the
Associate.
academic world. Yeah,
You moved on up. That's what I get for going by the
right.
back of your book.
Yeah, that book is what is it now? 4 or 5 years old, something like that.
I don't know, but it's very interesting, and it's about the liberal approach to the past. What do you mean by that? The liberal approach, like how is that different from, say, the positivist approach to the past?
Okay, good. Well, I think positivism is an outgrowth of liberalism in some way, a narrow school of philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, so I don't know. I can't define Popper's positivism positively, but what
There's a
I
tongue
mean.
twister.
Yeah, what I mean by the liberal history is the roots of the historical discipline. If you go back to the 19th century, when history was becoming a professional discipline for the first time, because it wasn't part of the medieval curriculum, right? History becomes a professional discipline. Largely, people like to think about Germany with Leopold von Ranke. There's others in France, but it's not really to like, I don't know, even I guess 1840s there in Europe, but 1880s that you start getting like professors of history that didn't exist before then. Most of these people called themselves liberals, and they were part of the liberal tradition, by which I mean in politics, we think of liberalism as, constitutions, democracy. But I mean liberalism in a broader sense about the search for truth, debate, um, uh, rational, empirical look at the past to negotiate what most likely happened. Now, for a lot of people, that's like, well, isn't that what history is? That sounds so obvious, right? Doesn't everybody do that? And I'd say no, because if you go back further, history was written for the kings and queens. It was written intentionally biased, and it often wasn't based on sources in so much as it was based on authorities. So people would say, well, Herodotus is an authority, so they would copy a bunch of text from him and put it in there. But there wasn't a lot of critical thinking. And it's with liberalism that we get like the hermeneutic, like the critical reading of the Bible, but we also get the critical reading of historical texts. And so liberalism is the recognition that human beings are free, that reality exists. We can investigate the reality from the traces of things that have been left behind. We can argue about this openly. And I was just thinking about, I don't have the quote, but I was just reading a book by Deirdre McCloskey, the economist. And she's got a thing in there about liberalism as critique and the ability to be open and allow for critique. This is in the history of the world, this is unique, right? So, to get back to my point, liberal history is an outgrowth of 19th century liberal Europe. It shapes and defines what the historical field is. Most historians today are have inherited that tradition, but a lot of it they don't recognize, they don't realize, or they reject. So, for example, the Marxist historians, the progressive historians, I think um, use less of the liberal tradition, the liberal approach to the past, than would say even just a moderate left liberal today would use more of that tradition than the Marxists. And I can talk in specific about some things that define it, but really, it's like this unrecognized foundation of the historical discipline. And people, when they write about approaches to the past, if you like buy a book that talks about the different schools of history, they're going to give you things like the psychological approach to the past and the Marxist approach and the um, the Annales school in France and like the total history, the geographic understanding of the past. But all of those are like very narrow, specific schools. And what I'm talking about is the ideas that really undergird basically all of modern history that I think are being lost and need to be revived. So that's why I've written two books about that. Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted. Mhm.
That's what I get. There were dogs
Yeah.
barking, garages opening. So, what is the name of your other book? I mentioned The Liberal Approach to the Past. What is the other one?
I have it on the shelf right here. One of them. All right. So I've now edited four and published four books. So two of the edited books, this is the one, What is Classical Liberal History? This is, I think, 2018. This is an attempt to bring together historians in the liberal tradition, primarily libertarians, but also a little bit broader, to talk about how the liberal people are thinking about history today. And by liberal, again, I don't mean the American left. I mean liberals in the long tradition of
Sure.
liberalism. So that's one I edited with various chapters. And then this one for Cato, The Liberal Approach to the Past, is my introduction again. Both of them have my authored introduction, but this one is a series of texts from historians in the past who talk about what it means to do historical research and what history is. Right. So it's kind of that one's a little bit of a level of abstraction, historians thinking about history, but specifically um, about liberal history. Yeah. So, and that's as a historian, I work with ethicists here in the Georgetown Business School, and sometimes with economists. And I like to work and think in different disciplines. So I've done some books that are on ideas and edited volumes, but I also do my own research. This one behind me on the wall is my new one, right there. History of slavery in New York. So both the sort of bigger picture theorizing about history, I've done some of that. This is the other one. This is my philosophy of history called creative historical thinking. But a lot of people that write philosophy of history or bigger meta historical stuff don't also do historical research, oddly enough. So I like to think of that I'm somebody who is a historian and, in a small way, a philosopher of history.
What one of the things that I really enjoyed that I didn't know, because I've never really thought about a liberal approach to history. I've of course heard of the Whig theory of history that, it's we're always making progress, but this liberal approach I didn't know. But in reading it, I was struck by how much influence these people would have had on somebody like a von Mises, because I'm
Mhm.
very familiar with von Mises. When we go over some of the historians, I didn't even include von Mises or Hayek because I'm very familiar with them. But
Mhm.
in reading some of these guys, their approach to, for instance, to focus on ideas and individuals and the values that individuals pursue as the essence of what shapes history,
Yeah.
I found it very, very interesting. So what I would like to do is just go through a series of these historians. And of course, I mean, you've written this book a long time ago. If you don't have all the particulars,
Mhm.
that's fine. But so what about we'll start with James Anthony, I think it's Froude, but it could be Froude.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. That the text that I reprinted from this guy, I think it's Froude, but I don't know. The text that I reprinted was from one of these like late 19th century, early 20th century mini pamphlets. These things are like 2 inches tall. Sometimes you see this with like religious people that have a tiny, tiny Bible so they can
Yeah.
bring it with them. But they were selling these things. I don't know. And it's as far as I knew, no, it was the only copy of this presentation that this Froude guy gave that I had picked up somewhere at like an antique store because I was collecting anything that I found on the philosophy of history. And it's a completely unknown name in the United States. There's a few books that when we go to grad school in history, they assign us. about the historical discipline. And one of them is called, ooh, I don't even remember anymore. It's called That Noble Dream. It's about the idea of history as a perfect science and this history of it. I didn't particularly like the book, but there's a whole bunch of there's a traditional story of the discipline which forgets these guys. And Freud is one example of them, and I don't remember exactly what he says or where he fits, but he's one of the British liberals who at the time inherited or were given these important like Regius chairs of history at Oxford and Cambridge. And the point that I wanted to make with him and some of the other ones, like I don't know if Lord Acton's in the book or not, but he's an example of one. Um, this
He's
Frederick,
not, but we could, if you'd like to talk about him, that's fine. I love
uh,
Lord Acton.
yeah, not too much. I'm not an expert on him. So Froude, Maitland a little bit. He is the legal historian. Acton, some of these other guys I mentioned in the chapter on Freud. Um, were like leading English intellectuals. And they established, as you say, history as the study of individual action. And so that's one of the key points of what I call the liberal approach, that I don't know if they arrived at it simultaneously and independently or they were talking to each other, but guys in France, guys in Germany, guys in England, a little bit in Italy, and then in the United States a little bit later kind of come up with these similar ideas that, when we study history, we're not studying the nation and how the nation acts. We're studying how individuals act. Now, you can divide that into like idealist schools that's like, well, we're really studying the ideas in the brain, right? And go like in that direction. Or rethinking the thoughts of the past, something like that. But in general, the point is that history is the study of, as you would say with Mises, it's the study of human action, of human decision making in the past. And the only people that can write history are human beings. I could debate this with my class. Somebody a couple weeks ago asked me, do you think AI is going to replace historians? Like it could, but the kind of history that it would write, I don't know. I don't think it would be very insightful. It wouldn't be very human. It would, maybe it can collect and sort a lot of data or come up with things that we don't know. But how can a computer understand the emotions that Caesar felt when he crossed the Rubicon? Right? The only reason we can is because we're humans and so was Caesar, and we assume that he probably thought similar to the way we did, right? So Froude and these others are thinking about that as there are individuals, we're like them, we can try to relate to them. At the same time, they have different cultures, so they think different ways. The past is a foreign country, as they say, and you got to learn the language of that country. Um, but at the same time, and when I check that text, Froude's writing about the science of history. They're attempting to make history scientific. This is in a liberal tradition. They want to, um, so science has debate, but science also has rigorous conclusions and laws and data and things like this. And so these early historians are struggling with that. How can we make history scientific? And they fight through this process and come up with different conclusions to it and solutions. But ultimately, all of these liberals are thinking about, um, how can we study the history of freedom? How can we study the history of, a lot of them are about the nation state because they see it as this great thing. But it's all with the end of human freedom or human beings being better because we know our history and we know more about ourselves. So the purpose of history from these liberal thinkers is different than, say, the historians who just want to justify the king or justify the Catholic Church through their history. Or today, um, well, a lot of people on the left want to write history of oppression, and their actual goal, their aim, sometimes I think, is to improve the world. Like they want to study what's bad so that we can fix it. Um, and that's kind of in the liberal tradition, but I think there's also people on the left today that want to study history like almost as rabble rousers. Like they just want to tear down. I mean, that's always part of the left. I mean, that defines the left. The element of change, of disagreement with what exists is always there. Um, and we just happen to call it the left. But yeah, that would I would think is deviating from the purpose of the liberal tradition as folks like this Froud guy
You know,
wrote about.
when I think about that sort of oppressor oppressed lens through which I guess for lack of a better term, the left sees
Mhm.
things, and I'm reminded of Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States. And I
Yeah,
remember him talking about the Aztecs. Now, he would criticize everybody for, that was on the oppressor side. But when it
yeah.
came to the Aztecs, who had an empire, and he talked about their human sacrifices, and he says, but there was something innocent about it because he didn't want to criticize the Aztecs. But then it's like you're just not being honest at that point, right? You're nitpicking. You're criticizing certain people but not others. And I'm a big fan of history being reality, right? Like America has been a very flawed country in many ways, and
Mhm.
it's been a very great country in many ways. And you can't really understand the United States if you don't get both. And to just focus on one or the other it just seems dishonest to me. Does that make sense to you as a historian?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course always a certain element of dishonesty in history, and I think, of course, that's what the liberal tradition was trying to expunge, to get rid of that. I mean, this is why footnotes, sources, argumentation, back and forth became part of historical writing in the 19th century. It allowed people to check things. Where did you get this information from? Is it possible? Is it correct? I've never read Howard Zinn. I've actually never read a history textbook. I
Oh,
like
they're
to say
so
that
boring. Oh my
yeah, I
Lord.
wouldn't, don't start. I like to say that I learned history from the primary sources because as an undergraduate, I worked for 4 years in my college archives. And so I learned it by reading the papers and looking at the photographs of old things.
Oh wow.
That way, you come up with your own interpretation about things. If you read it from the textbook, all you know is what everybody else believes. And it turns out I graded the US AP history test one time in Kentucky. In the summer, it's crazy. It's like 500 people. They put you in one huge room in a building in Louisville or somewhere else, and you grade the the multiple choice section, but then the essays of the US AP history test from around the nation for a full week. And back in the day, they paid like $1,600 for the week. It was torture. You read the same essay over and over and over again, and 90% of them are the same answer because the teachers all around the country are teaching from the same textbooks with the same interpretation,
Uh,
which happens to be moderately left wing. Not extreme, not Marxist, not conservative, not libertarian, but just moderately left wing. So a lot of the interpretations are of oppression. You'll like this story, and I've told it before. A friend of mine was in that giant room grading that day, and I'm a libertarian. He's aware of the libertarian tradition. I don't think he calls himself one. And at one point, I had an essay that was the answer written by an anarcho-capitalist, someone that knew the language of Murray Rothbard better than I did. And it was amazing. It was so insightful. It was so interesting. And I picked up that essay and I ran across the room and I showed my friend. I'm like, look, you're not going to believe this. There's a 17-year-old out there who knows all about all of this stuff. Like, this is like 10th on the list of possible interpretations that you would ever encounter as a historian. Like, most modern historians don't know what anarcho-capitalism is, let alone what a anarcho-capitalist historical interpretation might be, about like the state is the one that's at the root of all these problems. But anyway, I took the test back, and I read the essay, and I couldn't score it 100% because it didn't follow the diagram the way that they wanted, right? That was not ideological the way it was set up. It just happened to be that way. So the person, maybe it was a she, ended up getting a passing grade on the AP history test, but that grade didn't reflect the unique individual and rather genius answer that they put for this answer. And I'm just like, holy cow, because I didn't encounter any of that kind of thought until I was in grad school. I was apolitical. I never read Ayn Rand. I never read any of that until I was in my 20s. And so to see somebody at 17 show awareness of this, and I often tell that to my students too. Like, I've had some people write Marxist versions or whatever, and I'm like, that's great because it's different than the other version that I'm reading. I'd much rather read that. Show me that you can think critically through that tradition, and you're doing what historians do, which is think critically about things. So, whether Howard Zinn, a I don't know what the word is here, a distinction here between academic and popular history. Academic historians don't read Howard Zinn. It's falling more and more off our radar. The influence of it is pretty marginal. But I know, like in the popular history world, the history buffs, the online people, they read Howard Zinn, and so they know it. And I know that the influence is out there, probably more so on like junior high and high school teachers than on college professors because um, I don't know. History professors were also, we can be jealous of journalists and amateurs and people who get attention. Some of them are people who are good at boiling down things into good little stories, but it's kind of like a real physicist reading, something from a popularizer on TV. And they'll be like, but they got it all wrong. I mean, they summarized it in a simple way, but it's not rigorous, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to call a bit of an audible. I wanted to go through
Okay.
these historians, but you've actually
Yeah.
just had my mind going in so many different directions with this methodology of history stuff that
Mhm.
it's kind of coming alive to me.
Okay.
So you mentioned that there's an element of dishonesty in all history. Now, there was this guy, one of the guys that you mentioned, Maurice Mandelbaum, who is an adherent of the correspondence theory of truth, which is that the facts are facts, and the knowledge is the mind's correspondence or relationship to the facts, or
Mhm.
to yeah, to the fact, yeah, to the facts. And I believe it was him that differentiated between history and the past, because he
Mhm.
said that the past is just everything that's ever existed, whereas history is necessarily a selection. You have to choose what to focus on. We could never write or everything that's ever occurred. You have to
Yep.
choose based on individual values and whatnot. So that being the case, in your view, is it possible to have an objective approach to history where we're actually getting the reality of what took place, or is it going to every time be colored by the individual's bias and
Yeah.
personal preferences?
You ask a really good question. That's a question that's dominated like the philosophy of history. I doubt that Maurice Mandelbaum is the first one to ask it the way you did, about history versus the past. In fact, almost it's frustrating when you write a book and you think you do something well, and then you go on Amazon and you read reviews of similar books, because I've seen these types of reviews that say, wow, this book is amazing. It mentioned the difference between history and the past. Honestly, there's 100 philosophy of history books in the 20th century that make that distinction on page 3. They all make it. They all say that because that's at again at the fundamental point of being a historian is the past doesn't exist um, as this. Well, okay, so the past might exist as this independent thing, but history is the interpretation of the past. Now, as a you seem to know Mises. So as a Misesian or someone in the Austrian tradition, we understand subjectivity. And um, the aim in history is to write objectively or scientifically, rigorously. But all history is written from a perspective. And this is why I'm a big fan of multi-perspectival history, or I've given it different names, um, where I like lots of different approaches. So I think we understand, say, I don't know, the Civil War better if we have a Marxist approach, if we have a Southern historian, a Northern historian, an economist, a cultural historian. Like the more ways you can look at it, the better understanding you have of this thing. I was recently reading a book, Carlo Rovelli. The book says that he is the new Stephen Hawking or something. He's an Italian physicist. The book might be a couple decades old now, I don't know. But he's got this whole thing about time. And apparently, in Einstein's theory and all this stuff the physicists believe now about relativity, time is perspectival as well. So there is no universal time across the universe. It makes no sense to say that something is happening now here and also on Alpha Centauri. Because by the time something happens in Alpha Centauri 4 years later, the light beam hits you. Um, so yeah, I think there's a parallel there. I think all history is from a perspective, and yet we can still say that things are right or wrong or true or not. Um, some of these, there's a level of probability. There's a historian who wrote a book recently at Ohio State. I met him at a conference or something. I think his name is Staley, Staley. I could be mistaken. But he's got this interesting thing in his book where he shows sort of a line, and on this line it's a spectrum from like 0 to 100%. And we get a historical fact. Um, okay, the Normans invaded England in 1066. We put that at like 99%, right? Like we pretty much know that happened. It rained in on Tuesday, February 22nd, 1432 in Florence, Italy, right? Well, we had a source that says it, but we don't have another one that confirms it, so let's put that at 60%. When historians are telling a story, our facts, every fact and every interpretation that we're borrowing from somebody else falls on that spectrum from 0% probability to 100% probability. And we're weaving a story that connects those facts. People can weave that story in different ways or discount those facts or argue about those facts. So in the Netherlands, and so I speak Dutch and a lot of my research is on the Dutch, they have a tradition of calling history what do they I forget what they say in Dutch, an eindeloze gesprek or something, an endless conversation. So we never finish writing history. In fact, this is something I've thought about a little bit. Sometimes I test my students or uh, challenge them. Is history finite or infinite? That is, I think it's infinite. I think there's an infinite number of ways that we can arrange the facts and data of the past to come up with different stories. Just like there's an infinite number of songs that we can write from a finite number of notes, we can always add something to the story. So I'm not sure if the objectivity subjectivity debate that dominated the philosophy of history for a century, I it's still essential. I think they still talk about it in every philosophy of history class, but I don't think that's what people are writing about anymore. Um, and the Maurice Mandelbaum, why I really like him is because I think he provides the best um, defense of some objectivity, like of the existence of facts. Because you can go too far on that spectrum. You can go like very postmodern or challenging of this stuff and say everything is completely um, made up to serve power, that it's completely biased by the individual and by the archives and what they collect. And I don't know. I think it's important for historians to have an awareness of that. But if you go down that rabbit hole, you can't be a historian anymore. You're just a nihilist. I mean, and again, so liberal history is about human beings. We're writing history about ourselves, for ourselves, to improve ourselves and to improve our societies. And if you go so far in the relativistic tradition, you can no longer do that. You can't be a historian and you should give up. Because if you don't trust what you're saying, why are you even doing it?
So when I was reading the section that was written by Roy Childs,
Mm.
he was talking about revisionist history. And I'm really torn personally when it comes to revisionist history because on the one hand, I think it's important that we not just accept the standard line and that we go back and investigate and look into things. But then there's this part of me that I think it can go too far, almost like you just said when the with the objectivity subjectivity thing. This recent, I don't know if you heard about this thing on Tucker Carlson with the Daryl Cooper. I don't know if it's been
I
all
don't
over the
follow
place.
the news. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Daryl Cooper, they call him a popular historian, whatever that means. And he made a claim that Winston Churchill is the real villain of World War
Oh yeah.
II.
I did hear about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was immediately just torn to shreds by prominent historians. They said
Yeah.
he's just wrong. But one of the arguments is, well, yeah, but you have to be willing to go back and you don't want to check the standard line and you want to check things. And I think that's good. But when you start turning that into a fiction that fuels a narrative that you want to
Yeah.
push, that's dangerous. As a historian, is that a difficult line to straddle? To be willing to look at things, to understand your own perspective and your own values,
Mhm.
and bring that to the table, but not to so distort what you're bringing back as to make it just not an accurate depiction.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. It's a really good question. First, revisionist history means different things colloquially and among scholars. So most people think of revisionist history as an attack on our wholly written version of the past that is necessarily wrong, right? That's what most people think when they hear revisionist history. Historians are quick to say all history is revisionist. In fact, this is what I would say. I mean, if you're not revising, you're not actually writing history, you're just copying or chronicling the past. Every time we write a history book, we have a thesis, which is an argument saying this is the interpretation that's better than the previous interpretations of an event. That's always going to upset some people because some people want to believe the previous interpretation of the past. The liberal tradition is about coming up with different interpretations and having them work themselves out. And so I don't think revisionist history of either kind is bad, but there are bad attempts at revising history, right? So, I mean, I don't really know too much about Winston Churchill. I know he was involved in some things in Africa that don't seem to pan out so great. But from the perspective of a British person or a person in Western civilization protecting against Nazi Germany, seems like he did a pretty good thing, right? So there might be an argument to be made, but you hope in the long run that the good arguments beat the bad arguments. I mean, what's going on there, and what a lot of these modern history arguments are about, you noticed very keenly, is ethical claims. Something was
Yeah.
good or something was bad. Not exactly what happened, but whether it was good or bad. Um, that gets into a whole nother realm of ethical thought. And I've thought about this, and I direct an ethics institute. So I haven't gone in that direction, but I really want to start doing work on history and ethics. I once wanted to write a book called Ethics for Historians or something like that. Um, yeah, so I could go down that direction and talk about that some more. But yeah, in general, yeah, we can support the idea that we should be challenged and then still say, well, this is absurd. Like the Abraham Lincoln was homosexual or something. Like the evidence really isn't there. People want to get attention or come up with a different argument to push an agenda. I mean, but we all have agendas. The agenda might
Sure.
be British conservatism. We want to protect the image of
Yeah.
Churchill.
Yeah, I like that. That's absolutely correct. We all have agendas. People will say to me sometime online, "You're trying to get attention." Well, isn't that what we're all doing here?
Yeah.
I mean, we're posting things into this universe in order to get other people to pay attention to it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
why would I do it? I would just sit in my room and share my ideas with myself. But I
Can
wanted
I, can
to.
I, sorry, can I ask you briefly about the history of the Rational Ego podcast, since we're having a history talk? How did this come about?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I served 25 years in prison. I don't know if you knew that, but
No, I didn't read up on that.
oh,
I
okay.
didn't do my proper
Okay.
vetted
So
background check.
while I was in prison, I did a lot of reading. Ayn Rand, the Austrians. I studied a lot of libertarian thought. Outside, what I've learned since I've gotten out of prison is the Hoppe wing of the libertarian arguments I had not encountered while I was in prison.
Mhm.
But most of them I did. As a result of that, I said, well, I can't just read one argument. I need to read Keynes. I need to read Marx. I
Mhm.
need to read Kant, everybody that I can in order to get the best perspective. So I ultimately, from doing that, I wanted to become a psychotherapist when I got out of prison. In
Yeah.
the meantime, my cellmate and I were fed up with the way the prison system was run. Not that it was too harsh, that in many ways it was too lenient. I mean, well, as a libertarian, I'm sure you can understand how a government-run institution that's completely run out of public view would not be a very efficient enterprise.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so we ended up writing this book called Down the Rabbit Hole: How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime. From that, we ended up in communications with a conservative senator from Connecticut. That conservative senator then lost election, but I stayed in touch with him. He wanted to get me on air. So he was pitching me to all types of media outlets. Finally, he got me on a show called the Todd Feinberg Show. It's
Okay.
the most popular political talk show in Connecticut. So I went on, and when we were off the air after the first time I was on, he said, "Hey, how would you like to be a regular on the show?"
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, sure, of course I would." And then I hung up the phone. I went back to the cell and I said to myself, "Well, now what the hell am I going to talk about every week?"
Hmm.
But from doing that, from appearing regularly on his show and having to come up with different ideas, I realized that's what I wanted to do for a living. I love to argue. I love to talk. I love ideas. And I was good at it. And I was actually getting feedback from somebody who'd been in the business for, decades, telling me I was very good at it.
Yeah.
So when I got out, I went and I did a couple of guest host stints with him. And I appeared on a variety of podcasts, different talk shows and whatnot. And I met somebody on Facebook who is now my producer, and we were doing a sort of a live, I think it was on Facebook thing where we were, discussing ideas. And she mentioned that she had wealthy friends. And I said, well, any chance any of these wealthy friends of yours would like to finance a
Hmm.
upstart podcaster? And she said, I'll talk to you when we get off the air. And when I got off the air, she told me she would like to work with me.
Cool.
And so we got together and we collaborated, and she came up with the name The Rational Egoist. And that's how it got started. And I was shocked because I just said, let me back up just a little. When I first got out of prison, I was booking for the Todd Feinberg show, not
Mhm.
for money. I just did it because for one, I liked Todd and
Mhm.
we became good friends. But two, I thought it would be good experience for
Yeah.
me. And so I learned how to book. So now when I had my own show, I just started sending out requests for people to appear on the show. And I
Mhm.
couldn't believe it, but David Friedman agreed to come on and Richard
Yeah.
Epstein agreed to come on. And I was like, oh my
Right.
Lord, like that's what I was reading about these guys when I was in prison. I'm reading their
Mhm.
books and now I'm interviewing them.
Yeah.
And
That's what's amazing about the world today is you're really just an email away from almost anybody. Like almost
yeah,
any historian. I've emailed and got some responses from some very senior historians. David L. Teese, I was working on slavery. He's like one of the lead dudes in slavery. He wrote back to me. I'm like, fantastic. I teaching here at Georgetown. It makes a difference sometimes where you are. Georgetown's an elite university. It helps to have connections or a title. Um, and I once assigned my students to their assignment for the class was to interview an economic historian. So you have to find a book from somebody, read the book, maybe first email the guy and see if they're interested. Almost everybody universally likes talking about themselves. I'm sure you've discovered this. You email almost anybody that's not super, super busy and super, super famous. And they're like, I get to talk about myself for an hour. Oh, this is fantastic. I know
Yeah.
everything about myself, right? And exercise these demons and people get to listen to me. So my students, I had about maybe 15 students in the class that semester. You would not believe, maybe you would, the people that they ended up interviewing. One of them was Larry Summers, the former Fed chair,
Wow.
president of Harvard. I mean, some of them were just assistant professors at various places that were like, "Oh my God, this is my first interview. I wrote a book. A junior student at Georgetown wants to interview me. Oh, this is so great." So for my students, it was an assignment that not only did they have to read stuff and learn ideas, they got to talk directly with the person that wrote those ideas. They learned about transcription and they learned about how to write an introduction to that thing. And so I thought it was a great assignment. I haven't done it again, but yeah, if you look at the names of who they interviewed, they
I
maybe
believe it.
there's two things. One, I think Georgetown students are fearless and they're socially very competent. And so they're not afraid of emailing anybody. Second, though, I think a lot of them just go to Google and type economic historian, and then whatever is like the top result, they just email that guy because they don't realize maybe that there's a hierarchy or that there's actually thousands of economic historians out there, not just like the five that come up all the time.
Yeah, it's funny because I do that often. Sometimes I'll know who I'm reaching out to, but like the way I found you, I Googled experts on the history of liberalism
Hmm.
because I wanted the history of the idea of classical liberalism. But then you
Yeah.
you came up with, and it's a different angle on it, but it still was interesting to me. And I
It is.
find,
So
and
I'm a historian of the history of liberalism. So it's like an
yeah,
abstraction. There's a lot of books that have come out in the last few years about the history of liberalism, and a lot of them are written by political theory people. So it's a different degree, a different PhD, a different approach. And those people really know their stuff. They know their ideas. It's a very competitive field. It's another one of these fields where only 10% of them get jobs. Um, but they're not writing about history. They're writing about liberalism. So it's hard to explain.
it's funny because I interviewed a guy this way. I was looking to find somebody that to talk about the history of elections in the United
Mhm.
States.
Yeah.
So this guy responds, he says, "Sure, I'll come on." So I interviewed him. I had no idea who this guy was. Next thing you know, I see him he's on CNN, he's everywhere. It's Alan Lichtman. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he
I
came
know
up
the
with
name,
this.
yeah.
Yeah, he came up with this idea of 13 keys to predict elections, and he's
Oh,
predicted
that's right.
like
Yeah.
since 1980, he's gotten every
12
one
out of
right.
13. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
except for Bush v. Gore was
Okay.
the only one he got wrong. But I had no idea he was a big deal. I just wanted someone to talk about elections.
Right, right.
But it's absolutely true what you said is that you never know if you're just looking to talk. And I got to tell you, like doing this show, how much I've learned from the people that I have on.
Yeah.
It's like a classroom I'm in. I've talked to psychologists, philosophers, economists, professors, criminal justice professors, and I just learned so
And
much.
now when you go to the dinner party, you're like, oh yeah, me and Alan last week we were talking about, it's just like you just know these guys. I have that with my institute, and because I don't live in DC, but I've worked here for 10 years and I'm out in the country. But through my institute we have dinners, or I go to other institutes or political things. Like I've met I don't know how many congressmen or senators or whatever over the years. And yeah, some of these people that I've had dinner with, later end up being in the news for something. Sometimes not good, sometimes something bad. And I'll be like, I know that guy. You know, it's
You were at Georgetown. When I was in prison, I read Randy Barnett's book, The
okay.
Constitution, Restoring the Lost Constitution. And he, for me, solved the conundrum that I had intellectually that Lysander Spooner posed. Because I thought Lysander Spooner's right that a constitution can't have any authority, but I also thought a society can't function in anarchy like that. I wasn't, I had read Rothbard, he just didn't convince me.
Mhm.
And Randy Barnett solved that for me. And then it was such a big deal for me. And then I got to interview him. And
Oh, really? Okay,
oh
wow.
yeah, I was
I was gonna say maybe you don't want to try to interview him because he's always so busy.
oh he is.
Like
Well, by
he's
the
in
time I
demand.
got
He's
him,
great.
it took I think 6 months from the time
Okay.
I had to book him 6 months in demand, and that was after like 2 years of trying to get him on.
Okay. But you probably demonstrated to him that you really knew his ideas and he knew it was
Uh,
worthwhile
no, it
because,
was just someone knew him.
oh, okay.
So
Okay.
I
Convinced
knew
him.
someone that knew somebody, and it worked. And plus, he had a book coming out, so it worked out. But it was wonderful. So
Yeah.
on the liberal approach to the past, to bring it back around, what do you think is the history of this? I mean, what do you think the future is to this approach to history?
Um, it's a good question. I I really I'm not one of these historians. Like I don't consider myself a conservative really. I'm not one of these people who says everyone is wrong or every professor is a liberal jackass who's trying to push it. It's not true because I know these people and most of them are good. They're good-hearted. Some people have agendas, whatever. Um, I want to point out to them this, and not just to people on the left, but to people on the right, some of the basic fundamental things that go into history. And uh, here's one example. The word historicism means a lot of different things. With Popper, it means the opposite of what it meant before that. And there's a great German historian called Friedrich Beiser, and he's written about historicism. It's a very thick German, well, it's in English, but
Uh,
a German guy, right? And it's fantastic. But the liberals were mostly historicist in the sense that they were skeptical of laws and models of history and bigger forces. Again, it's the individual who acts, it's the individual forces in history. Now, in the 20th century, we have a lot of social science, economists, sociologists, political scientists who want to drop models on the past and say that these larger forces cause things to happen. Now, most historians today, even people on the left in the academy, might say something like Marxism and the model of history that Marx proposes. They might say, "Oh, that's interesting or useful," but they don't really actually agree because at heart they are those old school historicists. Historians believe in the uniqueness of phenomenon. They believe in the uniqueness of human beings to act. They don't think that we no longer believe that history has a providential or spiritual force pushing it in one direction. At least most people don't. We don't believe that there's um, civilizations are like human beings that act, or nations actually act. Like when we say France does this, we don't actually mean France does it. We mean the president of France made a
yeah.
decision for France to do X, right? And so at the root of liberal thought in history is this individual historicism that is essential for the discipline. Now, at the same time, oddly, I have been transitioning into an economic historian. And economic historians like models and laws. And it's hard for historians and social scientists to recognize, or to not recognize, but to uh, it's a very similar word, to allow these two to come together. I can't, when you're teaching or interviewing is when you lose your vocabulary. It's a phenomenon. Reconcile.
Reconcile.
That's the word. It's
Jinx.
hard to reconcile these two forces. Um, Mises gives you some help in this because Um, we can have individual actions and believe very strongly in individuals, and yet we can still have certain laws of economic behavior that shape how the world functions, right? There's a old saying in among historians from the 50s or 60s. Some guy said that there's lumpers and there's splitters. And the lumpers are people like the sociologists or the big historians that take everything, put it together, and say, oh, it's obvious that civilization is going to fall off a cliff in the year 2050 because I predicted it, right? Or every time this happens, this follows. And then there's the splitters, people like me for most of my career. You look at something very, very narrow and you say, no, no, this is an exception. This doesn't follow the rule that the other person established. Historians, again, like the individual, the unique, the exception. They say, my area of 13th century France does not apply to Marxist theory or something else. Like it just doesn't fit what I'm studying. And yeah, so historians resist a lot of that lumping and continue to focus on the particularities. Um, yeah, I think you can go both ways, but it's important to recognize that.
All right, Professor, before I let you go, is there anything that we should have talked about that we didn't?
Well, I don't know. We could talk about New England sports or something. You're up there. No, I'm good for that now. I just appreciate it. I wish you well with this, and
Thank
I
you so
think,
much.
like I say, I think it's great that anybody can talk about history. I believe that there's one last thing I'll say, I guess. In the Netherlands, where I've spent some time, when somebody is appointed to a full professor, so they're a big old name, 50 years old, they're a full professor finally, they give a public speech and they consider part of their job is public history, like reaching out to the public. They're a figurehead. They also, as a full professor in the Netherlands, you dominate a research paradigm that like people underneath you follow. So it's different than us. We're just all on our own in America. We don't fit together in like a group that researches one thing in a department. And so my view is that historians, especially those of us who are employed by the state or employed by society, we're lucky few that get to just think all day. We have an ethical obligation to the public to respond to people that ask us for podcast interviews, to newspapers that want to know something, because I know historians that are either too proud or too scared or whatever it is. They're only going to focus on their narrow little research field and never talk to the public. And I just think this is an absolute shame. I think we really do have an ethical obligation to also educate the public and not just our students.
All right, Professor. So where can people find you?
Online, I guess. I have a michaeljdouma.com. I have a website where I post my nonsense from time to time. And then I have a bunch of books. So, I mean, the big one coming out, like I say, is this New York slavery thing. I could talk about New York slavery forever. And yeah, that's
All right.
probably the place. Yep.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.